Hello, good evening, and good day, everybody, and welcome back to the Ask Abhijit show. This is episode 300, the history, the mysteries of history. Okay, uh, and I'm going to take questions that you all have asked in the comments. I've selected a bunch of those questions. I will take as many of those questions as possible over the next couple of hours. So, no super chat today, just questions from the comments, but let us see who all is there on the live stream. So, who do we have? Mary Kane, good to see you, ma'am. Real Vladimir Putin, Demon Crawler, Geopolitical Dubey from Indore, good evening, sir. M. Keshav, hello. Saksham Jasrotia, Vinit Kapper, Aryavarta 314, good evening. Demon Crawler once again. Ashwini Sharma, Shubh Sandhyaji, Pratardana Namaste, Meghna Kothari, hello. General Subutai, hello. Nirvana Shanks, away. Do I have an ear for David Bowie? Well, never been really exposed to David Bowie's music, but I'm sure a couple of his songs I've heard. Yes, all right. Nikita Anesthesia. Okay, good to see you this summer. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Uh, Alan J. Victor, namaskaram from Oman. Good to have you, sir. Namaskaram. Yash Nagarkar. Hello. Who else do we have? Karthik Pratap Singh. Hello, Swami. Once again, Demon Crawler. Devik Shriyan. Namaste. Anandam S2825. Hello. M. Keshav. General Subuthai. Ayush Singh. Pranam. Anant Pai. Piyush K. Namaskar. Sujal 5270. Vinit Kapper. Swami is here from Jaipur. Good to have you, sir, from Jaipur. Krishna of the Surinamese Netherlands. Always good to see you. Jai Guman, bonjour from Martinique en France. Well, bonjour to you, sir. Bharat M. Kulkarni from Tehran, New York. Okay, Ajay Rana. Crazy Brain, good evening. Good to see you. Crazy Brain, good to see you. Geopolitical Dubai says, Ni hao Shengji, sir. I think I'm acquiring a new Chinese name or something. Yes, I'm on the lookout for a Chinese name. We have a new ambassador to China who's been appointed. The new Indian ambassador to China, he has a Chinese name in addition to his own Indian name. So it looks like you can acquire an additional name. So I am on the lookout for a Chinese name for myself. In case some of you have some uh, recommendations, I'll take those. Dhairya Lavanya from Jaipur. Good evening. Namaste. Amrit Singh, Har Har Mahadev. Aries Manticore. Swami says, have you watched Young Frankenstein? I may have watched it. Is it a black and white movie? Is it a funny movie? I may have seen it. AB Normal. Is that the one? I can think of some other things too. Yeah, okay. I think I've seen that. The guy with the eyes. Yes. Okay. Nirvana Shanks once again. Dhairya, Lavanya, Sam the Gamer. Good morning. Real Vladimir Putin, Jai Shri Ramji, Om Nayak, and everyone else. Okay, I will stop now. Otherwise, I'll be greeting you all day and all night. Adil Bains, good evening, and everyone else. Okay. Let us. Jatin Shukla just came back from Jaipur Dialogues. All right. Vinny is here from NJ, New Jersey. Well, good to have you, sir. Good morning. Okay, let's get going with some questions. What questions do we have today? There's questions. Yes, let's take the questions. What's the first question? It's by Rushabh Tare. Who are the Druze people? And what's their belief system? What similarities does the Druze faith have with the Abrahamic religions? Why is it considered mysterious and secret where no one can convert or intermarry? Is it true that the Druze religion has many similarities or some similarities with Zoroastrianism and Hinduism? Can the Druze be put in the same basket as Yazidis and Kurds, or are they different? The Druze people. Who are these Druze people? So they're a small religious group, Arabic speaking religious group, that is found in West Asia, in Jordan, Syria, parts of Israel, Lebanon as well. And the total number is approximately 1 million people. Okay. So if you look at the map, it's in these people, they live in West Asia, kind of, similar region as the Kurds and the Yazidis. So the Yazidis are found in northern Iraq, um, and the Druze people are found in Syria, Lebanon, uh, Jordan, Israel, maybe Iraq. I'm not sure about Iraq, but definitely Western Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean seaboard, that region. Okay, small population, about 1 million people. There are some Druze people in Venezuela as well, apparently in South America. Maybe a few tens of thousands, that sort of thing. So that's where these people live, the Druze people. Okay, they are an Arabic-speaking people, and their religion is a monotheistic religion, and they say that the god they worship is the god that the Jews, Muslims, and Christians worship. Same god. So that means that this is an Abrahamic religion, a minor Abrahamic religion, one of the Abrahamic religions, but a small number of people practice this religion. Let's find out how many people practice Judaism globally. Let's find out. How many million will that be? Let me see. How many Jews in the world? How many? What's the total Jewish population? Okay, 14 million, 15 million. That's the global Jewish population. So the Druze are about 1/15 of that. Okay, so pretty small population. So now, what are the characteristics of their religion? First of all, like I said, it's a monotheistic religion. It's an Abrahamic religion. Their God is the same God as that of the Jews and Christians and Muslims. They believe in the prophets that the Abrahamic people believe in, Moses and Noah and Jesus and Muhammad and whoever else the Abrahamic prophets are. Abraham, obviously, right? And so on. What else is there in the religion? What makes it unique? So what makes the religion unique is that they don't believe in a day of judgment. They don't believe in heaven and hell. The Druze people, they believe in reincarnation. What? Abrahamic religion, monotheistic religion, but they believe in reincarnation? Well, yes, they believe in reincarnation. So that's what makes the religion unique, and they have their own holy texts or something. I don't know what they are called. Okay, you can look it up. I cannot remember foreign terminology, Arabic terminology. So they have some holy texts of their own, minimal holy texts, not like extensive documentation or literature. And they don't intermarry. They practice monogamy, not polygamy. That's another difference between their religion and and for example, Islam. So they don't marry multiple wives. They don't convert out of the religion. You can't convert into their religion. That's not allowed. So let's say you are somebody who practices some other religion and you say, yeah, you know what, I want to convert to Druzism, whatever. It's not allowed. You can't do that. So you can be Druze only if your parents were Druze. That sort of thing. So it's a pretty insular kind of religion. It is said to have similarities with Zoroastrianism and Hinduism. The clearest similarity is that they believe in reincarnation. That is what the dharmic religions or faiths or culture believes in, right? Reincarnation. So the Druze believe in that. But they believe that if you are a male person, the moment you die, you are reincarnated immediately in a different body. And if you are male, then you will be reincarnated male only. And if you are female, you will only be reincarnated as a female. So there's no cross-pollination of genders or whatever. In the dharmic system, you can be a male in one birth and a female in another lifetime, right? But in the Druze system, if you're male forever, no matter how many times you're reborn, that sort of thing. So that's about the Druze people. They have been persecuted historically at various points in time. In more recent years, they have been the target of massacres by ISIS, right? So the Druze have been treated by ISIS the same way that they treated the Yazidis. Not sure about the Kurds. So can the Druze be put in the same basket as the Yazidis and Kurds? Well, the Yazidis aren't an Abrahamic. Their religion isn't Abrahamic. I'm not sure if they are considered to be Abrahamic. The Yazidis. They do say that their religion is monotheistic, Yazidi religion, but clearly it has way more elements of Indian culture than the Druze religion. So the Yazidi religion is different. And the Yazidi people also aren't Arabic. They may perhaps speak Arabic today because of circumstances, but they are not an Arabic people. They are an Indo-Iranian people, the Yazidis. Even the Kurds are Indo-Iranian. They speak a Persian or Iranian religion. And the Kurds, they practice Islam, standard Sunni Islam, if I'm not mistaken. And the Druze faith religion, it's a descendant of a Shiite form of Islam, right? A pretty interesting and unique religion, small Abrahamic religion, descended from Shiite Islam, Shia Islam, and they believe in reincarnation. And they have some peculiarities that are absent in mainstream Islam or the other Abrahamic religions. So that's the Druze people. Pretty interesting religion that they have. Okay, I suppose that's the answer. All right, next. Rushabh Tare once again says, how did Russia retain the permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council after the USSR disintegrated? Didn't the US try to block Russia? They had an excellent opportunity in 1991 to remove Russia permanently and isolate it. So why did the US not grab it? Replacing communist China or Taiwan is a prime example of replacement. The Russians had a weak leader, Boris Yeltsin. So why did the US step back? So here's what happened in the early 90s, 1991, 92. That's around the time when the USSR disintegrated. Okay. Gorbachev steps down, Yeltsin takes over. There is chaos in Moscow. The White House of Moscow, the parliament building is bombarded. There's lawmakers stuck inside. Yeltsin on the streets, he climbs on top of a tank and shouts democracy, democracy, or whatever he shouts. Yeah, he was pretty young and much more sober at the time. And there's chaos across the length and the breadth of the USSR. And more than 10 republics, SSRs, secede from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So these are the Commonwealth of Independent States, the stans and so on and so forth. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the stans, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. So all these little and large states seceded from the USSR. And what was left? What was left was what is today Russia. Okay. So now the question for the United States was, how do we deal with this potentially super chaotic situation? Why potentially super chaotic? Because the USSR was a superpower and their assets were distributed among these various newly emerged nations, in addition to most of the assets being in Russia. Now, the assets that concerned the US were nuclear weapons. You had Soviet nuclear weapons in various parts of the USSR, and now many of these parts of the USSR were now independent. And even for these newly independent republics, those nuclear weapons were like hot potatoes. They did not want to have those. So they all get together, okay, the former Soviet republics, they all get together and they decide, you know what, let's give all of this back to Russia, and we will tell the world that Russia should continue on in the United Nations in place of the erstwhile USSR, and we are completely fine with that. So all the erstwhile Soviet republics, newly independent Soviet republics, they came together and they announced that we want Russia to be the continuation of the USSR in the context of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. So that was the will of the newly independent Soviet republics. Now you have the US. The US has just won a major victory, a victory that was decades in the making. They have defeated the USSR. They have disintegrated the USSR. And the US was now worried that what if there is proliferation of nuclear weapons? Uzbekistan says, I want to have 78 nukes. Tajikistan says, I want to have 15. And what if there's chaos and these all nations, that power goes to their head and they start acting crazy. So the US also wanted a stable situation. So they supported the Commonwealth of Independent States and the transfer of the nuclear weapons, whichever wherever, to the Russians. The Americans even ensured that Ukraine transfers its nukes to Russia, and the US was perfectly okay with Russia continuing as the successor state of the USSR in the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. Why? Why this? We can understand that the US did not want proliferation of nuclear warheads. But why allow Russia to continue on in the UN Security Council? In the UN Security Council, you have special privileges. You see, the post 1945 world order was a hierarchical order, and there was a privileged bunch of nations, the P5 nations, the 5 nations that are permanent members of the UN Security Council, which is the US, Russia, USSR, China, the UK, and France. Now, USSR was to be replaced with Russia. Why did the US allow this to happen? Because the US at the time believed that they were in complete control of the universe. They were now the lords and masters of the universe. Russia was this broken country with a devastated economy and a leader that was a US asset, apparently. Boris Yeltsin, even Gorbachev most likely was a US asset in some way or the other, right? The US thought that we have them by whatever hurts the most. So then let them continue and we're going to control them completely. So you have, after the disintegration of the USSR, you have Gorbachev appearing in a Pizza Hut commercial. So that's the kind of infiltration the Americans had achieved in the erstwhile USSR by that point in time. That Gorbachev, the former president of the USSR, one of the two most powerful men on earth, now appeared in a Pizza Hut commercial. And you had Yeltsin, who was all friendly with Clinton and so on. So the Americans thought, we are in full control. Let them continue on in the UN Security Council. And if they did not allow Russia to continue in the UN Security Council, that would create some kind of crisis in the UN Security Council, because the original charter would no longer apply and all kinds of procedural issues and so on. So just to smooth things over, the Americans said, okay, let it continue. Let the Russians continue as was one of the P5 nations, and we will be able to deal with them. And as long as Yeltsin was there, Russia was under American control. I mean, Russia was under control. Not directly under US control, obviously, but under control. Things were under control. It's only when there's a transition from Yeltsin to Putin that then, after a few years, the Americans started wondering, what on earth has happened here? Something has gone wrong. Putin isn't what we expected. But by that time, it was too late. Right? By the time it was too late to change things. So the Americans did not want to permanently isolate Russia. They wanted to infiltrate Russia. They wanted to take over Russia's resources. They wanted to destroy the Russian economy further. And for some time, they kind of achieved that. Right? Russia wasn't in chaos. There were the two Chechen wars. First Chechen war was a disaster for Russia. Yeltsin lost it for Russia. So the Americans didn't want to isolate Russia. Remove Russia permanently. They wanted Russia to be a new US vassal. The nation with the largest resources in the world. Why isolate it? Bring it, integrate it into the American-led Western economy, right? That's what the Americans wanted. So, in hindsight, maybe it was not a very wise move, but at that time, it was the unipolar moment. It was a moment of euphoria. It was a moment of invincibility. I mean, apparent invincibility for the US. They were now the rulers of the universe, the masters of the universe. And that's why they were perfectly happy for this to happen. But today, well, after the Ukraine war started, the Ukrainians have been raising questions about whether allowing Russia to continue on as the successor state of the USSR as a P5 nation, was that legal? Was that right? The Ukrainians have been raising questions about that, but that's like 35 years too late, right? So, okay. What's done is done. It's a done deal. It's a fait accompli, like they would say in French. Okay. Next, the question. And the next question is by it's by Rushabh Thare once again. Okay, Rushabh Thare is on a roll today. The question is, if China invented gunpowder, Why did it remain so backward compared to the modern artillery of the Europeans? Did the Chinese emperors make the same mistakes which Indian emperors made? Or were there other reasons why they did not really use gunpowder for military purposes? Or did they not think that this will be used against them in a different way? Okay, so the question of gunpowder, it's a pretty vexed question. It's a pretty controversial question because there is significant evidence that actually it's India that invented gunpowder, but the European scholars and Indian historians and so on, they gave the credit to China first, but the Chinese invented. So we'll not get into the debate for the context and purpose of this question. Okay, most likely it was India that invented gunpowder, but the credit isn't given. You ask Chat GPT, I suppose, it will say, no, China. You ask Google's AI, it will say, no, China did it. Shall we do that? Let's do that before we. Okay, let's do that before we actually address this question. Okay. Which civilization invented gunpowder? There we have it. See? So they'll say China. So we will not go into that controversial question right now. But assuming that China was using gunpowder 1,000 years ago, which it was, in that context, let's consider this. So China, China was using. There were periods of time after the Tang dynasty where there was conflict in China. After each imperial cycle, there's a period of chaos in China. And you sometimes have 2 or 3 dynasties that are competing for hegemony and so on and so forth. The Song versus the whoever and so on. So about 1100 or so years ago, we know that the Chinese were using gunpowder against each other. Okay, they were using gunpowder, and Chinese emperors had saltpeter. They used to have the standardized production of saltpeter and sulfur and so on, which are components of gunpowder. And gunpowder weapons were used in pretty standardized ways. The Chinese had these spears, in which at the front you would have gunpowder, and that would explode and it would emit shrapnel, which essentially is one of the oldest depictions of a firearm, of a handheld firearm. Like today you have rifles and so on, that sort of thing. So that's a precursor of handheld firearms. And there were rockets that the Chinese used, and bombs of various kinds, and handheld weapons, and projectiles, and rockets means missiles and so on. So the Chinese did use this in warfare. It's not that the Chinese did not use it in warfare, but they used it against each other. Okay? And eventually, once Chinese empires stabilized during an imperial cycle, there would be no other challenger within China. And then the challengers would be those on the outskirts of China. Those who lived in the steppes, the Tatars, the Turkic tribes, the Mongols, and so on. Right? And generally, and these were nomadic peoples. And gunpowder wasn't relevant to defeating them. See, gunpowder in the ancient days, it was used in siege warfare. It was used in pitched battles, where you have a battlefield on which you have two armies that have come face to face, and they decided, okay, today we're gonna fight. We're gonna see who wins. In that situation, which is called a pitched battle, gunpowder and firearms and rockets and bombs and projectiles are relevant. Or if you have siege warfare, where you have an army that has besieged a castle or a city, and you're using projectiles and gunpowder, projectiles and bombs and whatnot to try and break down the walls. In that situation, once again, gunpowder is relevant. But when you have a situation where you have horse riding archers who are coming at you in all directions, those older variations of gunpowder weapons were not relevant. So when it comes to the Chinese empires fighting off the nomadic steppe tribes like the Tatars, the Turkic tribes, the Mongols, etc., gunpowder wasn't relevant. So because of that, gunpowder usage continued, but it was never iteratively improved in a rapid manner. Okay, so gunpowder was used in China during the Yuan dynasty, and after the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty was a conquest dynasty. It was founded by Sri Chinggis Khan, right? So it was a Mongol dynasty that ruled China for a while. Kublai Khan was their first great emperor, of course, but retrospectively, it's Genghis Khan who was the first, who was the founder, and so on. After the Yuan dynasty, you have the Qing dynasty, right? And once these dynasties take over the whole of China, they do not really feel the need to iteratively and rapidly improve their weapons and artillery and all that, improve by using it. And overall, you use it, you find some defect and deficiency, you find some scope for improvement, and you make that improvement. Then again, you use it, then over time, you keep improving, and that's how your weapons get better. That situation never arose in China. Now, let's consider Europe. At some point in time, gunpowder reaches Europe. And in Europe, you had a totally different situation. Europe was this mass of small states, nation states, kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and so on, who are constantly fighting each other. The European tribal wars. The region of Europe is a very tribalistic region. All kinds of petty conflicts, they're always fighting each other. So in the Middle Ages, etc., there was constant warfare in Europe. Constant warfare. Petty warfare, larger scale warfare, but constant warfare. And because of that, there was a tremendous incentive in Europe for weapons to be iteratively, rapidly improved. Because whoever made even a small improvement had a qualitative advantage over their adversaries. And when that happened, the adversaries were also incentivized to very rapidly address the gap in capabilities. And that's why you had very rapid iterative improvement of artillery and so on, and gunpowder weapons in Europe. And eventually these were standardized. And European engineers and scientists were also incentivized to get involved in this, which obviously, once you have engineers and scientists getting involved in this, things improve rapidly. So on the one hand, in Europe, you have constant improvement over years, over decades, over centuries. In China, you had stagnation because there was no urgent pressing need to keep improving the weapons. So eventually by the 16, 17, 1800s, there was a situation where the Chinese had to start importing superior European weapons. Right? And eventually, obviously, because by the time they had fallen behind in their capabilities and technology. So it's like the Chinese, 1,000 years before today, they were using gunpowder. The Europeans had no idea what gunpowder was. But by the 1800s, the Europeans were far ahead of the Chinese. So it's a process that took 800, 900 years, right? It did not happen over a couple of weeks. So it's a process that took time. And over time, everything changes, right? I mean, India invented mathematics, but look at where India is today compared to the West, right? Where does all the research and all that happen today? Where do all the advancements happen? They happen in the West. India came up with all of these concepts that are the backbone of modern mathematics and science, but today India is nowhere, right? So things change over time, but that process takes centuries. Okay. So you can't really blame the Chinese for this. Their situation was different. The challenges they faced were different. They were very, very different from the challenges the Europeans faced. And that's why the Europeans, because of those challenges, improved very rapidly. Rishabhadatta Goswami says, please don't get angry. Don't get angry. I have a sensitive question. Okay, what's your sensitive question? If our ancient Gurukul and temple university systems were so intellectually superior, why did they fail to produce the industrial and military scale needed to stop the colonial factory system? Was the failure in our minds or just our inability to scale that brilliance to the masses? So we just now discussed why China, who is said to have invented gunpowder, why did China, the supposed inventor of gunpowder, eventually fall behind the Europeans in firearms and artillery? Significantly behind. Similarly, India is the nation that essentially, it's the civilization that invented higher education, systematic education, philosophy, science, the scientific method, mathematics, all of that, through the Gurukul system, through the temple university system, through the Vishwavidyalaya system, and so on. India is the pioneer and inventor of standardized education, right? India gave this to the world. And yet, look at where India is today. India has one of the worst education systems in the world. You can keep harping on NEP 2020 or whatever the hell you want to harp on if you're the government of India, but it's trash, it's garbage. Right? Now, go back a couple of centuries, 3 centuries, and you had the Europeans who, by the 1600s, were introgressing into India, and they had their colonial. They were establishing, setting up the the seeds of the colonial factory system and so on, right? So why did our Gurukul and temple education system, which was so allegedly intellectually superior, why did it fail to keep up with the Europeans? That's the question Rishabh is asking. And Rishabh is worried that I'll get angry. No, it's a good question. Well, the answer is, by the 1600s, 1700s, the temple education system and university education system was extinct. Especially the university education system. It was completely extinct. India's universities, which were very numerous in quantity, many of them we don't even know what they were called anymore. They are in ruins, but we know a few. Takshashila, Nalanda, Odantapuri, Tilhara, Sharda Peeth, and so many more, right? So many more. Vallabhi, and yeah, we had so many of these universities all over the place. These were all destroyed 1,000 years ago. And then India gradually came under Turkic occupation, and the Turks sought to eradicate at the roots India's culture. So they destroyed temples all across northern and western India, eastern India as well. Southern India, temples survived to some extent. But northern India was ravaged, western India was ravaged, even eastern India was eventually ravaged. So if your universities are burned to ashes, the libraries are burned to ashes, they are dismantled brick by brick, if your temples are destroyed, if your gurus, your teachers are beheaded, how do you expect that system to still produce industrial and military scale needed to stop something that happens in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s? How do you expect that? You understand chronologically the problem. The universities were destroyed around 1000 or 1100 AD. The temples by 1500 AD in northern, western, eastern India were mostly destroyed. India was under foreign occupation. India was under siege. India's culture, civilization, and people were under siege. The Indian system no longer, by that time, functioned the way it was supposed to function. It was barely surviving. The whole civilization, the whole population was in survival mode. We were way down here in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you're way down here, survival mode in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how can you achieve the higher order, aspirations of human society? You can't. Do you understand? So that is what happened. So the Turks ravaged India, destroyed India. And when the Turkic empire started declining, eventually, that's when the Europeans, they stepped in to fill the vacuum of power in various parts of India. Eventually, the Maratha Empire did rise and reclaim and liberate India for a while from Turkic occupation. But then they too failed. And that's when the English took over. So that is what happened. Please understand that there was no temple education system, university education system in 1600, 1700, 1800. At some level, lower education still continued until the 1800s. So lower education in village temples, etc., continued until the 1800s. But not higher education. So lower education means teaching arithmetic and grammar and that sort of thing. 2 + 2 = 4, 10 × 12 = 120, 17 × 3 is whatever, and so on. That sort of basic education was there. So that's what happened, you see. Rushabh Tare once again says, what was the Spanish Armada and why was it sent? Why did the Spanish Armada fail? And how Queen Elizabeth built the British fleet, the seeds of British naval power? How did it shape the eventual British colonization of the Americas and Asia and India? Could it be considered an inflection point in history as it gave rise to the Royal Navy, a navy that ruled across oceans? Okay, so the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada was from what? 1588, was it? Was it 1588? I think it was 1588 when you have Elizabeth. Elizabeth. Okay, so let's understand the context. We are talking about 1588, late 16th century. Queen Elizabeth has been in power for some time. Britain is once again a Protestant nation. Now, let's understand the context. Queen Elizabeth's father was King Henry VIII. Now, this is a fantastic guy, okay? Brilliant, very interesting guy. You can make a movie series, TV series about him. I'm sure there are. So the guy married 6, 7, I don't know, 5, 6 wives, beheaded half of them. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, Spanish. And she produced one daughter that is Mary Tudor. Then King Henry VIII wanted a male child. So he had a male child with one of his mistresses, but the male child died pretty young, I suppose. He was king for a bit. Then he married Anne Boleyn. With Anne Boleyn, once again, he had a female child, that's Elizabeth. Then he had Anne Boleyn dispatched and he married, I think, at least 3 more ladies. I forget the Catherine Parr and whoever the names are. Not Anne of Cleves. Yeah, there was a marriage with Anne of Cleves as well, German lady. But it was annulled and so on and so forth. Long story. So after Henry VIII died, see, Henry VIII, okay, he was born Catholic. England was Catholic at the time. But he wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But for that, he needed the permission from the Pope. A king needed the Pope's permission to divorce his wife. And the Pope refused to give permission. So the king said, Henry VIII said that, you know what, I renounce the Catholic Church. I'm going to set up my own Church of England, the Anglican Church. England is now going to be Protestant henceforth. And so he divorced Catherine of Aragon, married Anne Boleyn, and had Elizabeth with her. So after he dies for a while, his son is king, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but he dies young. And then Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, becomes queen of England. Now, Mary says Mary was the daughter of a Catholic queen, and her father was also Catholic when Mary was born. And her father divorced her mother and became Protestant to marry Anne Boleyn. So Mary, once she became queen, she undid whatever her father did and made England Catholic again. And then she went after, she executed a reign of terror in England. And went after all the Protestants. And that's why she was called Bloody Mary. Maybe some of it is propaganda or whatever, but she is remembered as a very cruel queen. And she's remembered as Bloody Mary. But eventually Mary dies and Elizabeth becomes queen. And she once again turns England Protestant. So during Henry VIII's time, it's Catholicism, then Protestantism, then Mary comes to power, Catholicism again, then Elizabeth comes to power, Protestantism again. Now, the Spanish were Protestants. They were Catholics. And they hated the Protestants. So, now let's understand the geopolitical situation. By the mid-1500s, the Spanish were in possession of vast territories in the Americas. See, 1492, Christopher Columbus announced that I have discovered India, but turned out to be a new continent. Okay, the Americas. And by the mid-1500s, the Spanish had taken over Cuba, present-day Haiti, Dominican Republic, Florida, Central America, parts of South America, Venezuela, and so on. They already had this big empire, imperial possessions in the Americas. And then they had the encomienda system of slavery and genocide and all that. And they were extracting tremendous amounts of wealth out of the Americas. And they had a powerful naval fleet, the Spaniards. Now the English, they had this modest naval fleet, and they could not compete with the Spanish in outright warfare. So the English under Elizabeth, they took a different approach. It was called privateering, or privateering, privateering, privateer. The spelling is Privateer. Okay, Privateer, privateer. A private person or ship that engages in maritime warfare under a commission of war. Now, if you rearrange the words privateer, what do you get? Let's remove the R, P-I. Okay, let's take the R and put it after I, P-I-R. Remove the V, A-T-E. Privateer means pirate, actually. Okay, so Elizabeth, under her rule, you had English pirates who were raiding Spanish ships and stealing their treasure and slaves and whatnot. Okay, officially the government of England was not involved in this, but unofficially Elizabeth was behind all of that. So this was piracy. So England is the nation that gave the world piracy and all the cruelty that is associated with that, and it gave rise to the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, I suppose, eventually. So this was obviously theft and plunder and contravention of international law and whatnot of that time, and that's what Elizabeth was doing. So these pirate ships were pretty lean and mean ships, low-built ships with cannons, and they did plunder and theft and all that. So eventually the Spaniards got tired of this, and they said, "Let us build the big Armada, a big naval fleet of 130 ships. And we will take this gigantic naval fleet of big, huge, massive, heavy, powerfully armed 130 ships. We're going to invade England. We're going to depose Elizabeth, do regime change operation. We're going to install a puppet regime of our own. And we're going to change the religion once again to Catholicism. And we will rule England." Okay, and some of the ships, they had orange trees because the Spanish wanted orange trees in England when they would rule England and so on. So they were certain they would succeed. So about 130 ships were launched from Spain, big, massive ships. Compared to the Spanish galleons and ships, the English naval ships were tiny, small, low built. They could not even do any, boarding activities, boarding the other ship. And they had cannons. The Spanish had like God knows how many cannons. English ships would have like 4 or 5 maybe cannons or whatever the number was, right? So it looked like a mismatch. And the English ships were smaller in number also. I don't know how many ships they had, but significantly less than the number of Spanish ships, which is 130, roughly 130. So the Spanish launched the Armada. And Elizabeth comes to know about this, and she orders her navy to go and defend England, the kingdom. And there's this naval engagement. And what you find is that the English ships are very agile, very nimble. They're fast moving. They can't be boarded. They can fight at standoff distances of contemporary standoff ranges. And they destroyed, to some extent, the Spanish fleet. The Spanish could not match the agility, the nimbleness, the maneuverability, and the firepower of the English ships. They could not board the English ships and fight the way they were accustomed to fighting. Boarding means you have two large ships who will come close to each other, and then you will put ladders on top, and you'll jump with swords in your hand, and then you'll go clash. That's boarding. But when you have a big ship and a small ship, and the small ship is agile and faster, you can't board the small ship. So that manner of warfare is gone. So it's what it's reminiscent of, kind of. You have a very powerful 21st century army with all kinds of extremely expensive weapons, and that can be taken out by inexpensive drones and large quantities of ballistic missiles, kind of like that. So the English redefined the nature of naval warfare. They defeated the Spanish Armada, and then the Armada, to pour insult on injury or salt on the wounds, it was caught in big storms, and a lot of these ships were dashed against rocks, and many of them were sunk. Some of them were shipwrecked off the coast of Scotland, Ireland, wherever, and the sailors were killed by the natives, that sort of thing. So it was an absolute disaster for Spain. So that was the Spanish Armada, which failed completely. Now, how did this? Was this an inflection point in history? Did this give rise to the Royal Navy? No, it did not give rise to the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy already existed. Half of the Royal Navy was a bunch of pirates, absolute cutthroat barbarians. Okay, but it proved to the British and to the world that this is the right way to do warfare going forward. Okay, and the Spanish once again built a fleet, but they never tried. So it was not the end of the Spanish Navy or whatever. The Spanish had tremendous resources. They had all this gold and whatnot flowing in from the Americas. So they were able to rebuild a navy. But they never attempted an invasion of England again. Okay? The last successful invasion of England was in the year 1066. After that, England has never been successfully invaded until now, when you have the Pakistanis and all grooming gangs who invaded England and take over. That's a different story. So that is a different story. But yeah. So that is what happened, but it's kind of an inflection point because it gave rise to a new way of doing warfare, and it was a proof of concept for the British, and that's the basis on which the Royal Navy was built in larger numbers, and the ships they built were based on the ships that succeeded against the Spanish Armada, and eventually the British naval power became the initial backbone of the expanding British Empire, and this gave rise to eventually the Royal Navy. But the Royal Navy already kind of existed at this point. And yeah, it did shape eventually the British colonization because of the expanding navy, of the trade routes, and eventually the colonization of India and the Americas and so on. So 1588 is when this event happened. By 1510 or so, the British had put a foothold in the Americas, which was Jamestown, a disaster, absolute disaster. And then you had Plymouth about a decade or so later, whatever the dates are. By what, 1720 or something, you had Plymouth and Jamestown and Plymouth both have happened. Roanoke also happened, which is a totally different story. And eventually the British were the big winners in the Americas, right? We know that. So that's how it went with the Spanish Armada. Rishabhdatta Goswami says, in light of the direct assassinations of sovereign heads of state and the bypassing of the UN Security Council in the current ongoing Iran versus Israel and US conflict, has the 1648 Westphalian concept of state sovereignty finally been replaced by a civilizational might doctrine where only 4 or 5 pole nations have actual rights. The rest are merely buffer zones. Okay, so I would not agree it's a civilizational might doctrine. It's an imperial might doctrine. Because the US isn't a civilization, it's an empire. Okay? It's imperial might or military might doctrine. It's not civilizational might. Now, coming back to what you're asking, so what have we had? This is kind of a question that's on the border. That's both history and geopolitics. And that's why I've taken it. So what we've had in this current ongoing Iran conflict is the Americans and Israelis have taken out they have assassinated the supreme leader of Iran, the head of state of Iran, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, right? And they've assassinated lots of scientists, engineers, generals, and high-ranking Iranian officials. The number 2 person, Ali Larijani or whoever he was assassinated a few days ago. So this is extremely unusual, essentially unheard of. In the Westphalian system, even when you have 2 nations at war, you don't assassinate heads of state. You don't do that. This is extremely unusual. It's unheard of, actually. So what's the Westphalian system, the Westphalian concept of state sovereignty? The current world order is the Westphalian world order, right? Westphalian sovereignty, Westphalian world order. So in the Westphalian system, you have nation states, okay? And theoretically or technically, each nation state is sovereign, which means that it has, according to international law, complete control over its territory, its population, and no nation is allowed to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. So if I'm a sovereign nation, I can have my own laws, my own rules, my own constitution, my own norms of how to govern my nation and my people and my territory. I can have a democracy, I can have a theocracy, I can have a dictatorship, I can have whatever. It's my internal matter. Everybody else, mind your own goddamn business. That is the concept of Westphalian sovereignty. Complete sovereignty over your territory, and your people. That's Westphalian sovereignty. And it doesn't matter how large or small a nation is. As long as you are an internationally recognized nation state, no matter how large or small you are supposed to be exempt from foreign interference in your internal affairs. So that's the theoretical or technical concept of Westphalian sovereignty. Now, the post 1945 system, the post Second World War system, is not exactly a system of equal rights for nations. It's a two-tier system. It's a hierarchical system. On the one hand, you have the privileged nations. That's the P5 nations, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. These 5 nations are privileged nations. Other nations are non-privileged nations. What privilege do the P5 nations have? Well, they have the all-important veto in the United Nations Security Council. What does this veto, what's the role of this veto? So the veto allows the P5 nations to block the enforcement of international law wherever their interests are concerned. So if there's something that goes against the interest of a P5 nation, that P5 nation can unilaterally block the execution and implementation and enforcement of international law. That is a very powerful weapon to have, the veto. So India was offered a P5 membership multiple times, at least 3 times, by the US and USSR. But India, under the great Mr. Nehru, insisted that this be given to China. And that's why China is a P5 nation today. India is not. Now that's a different story. So you have a hierarchical system since 1945. Okay, the privileged P5 nations and the rest of the world, the riffraff. Okay, now since the early 1990s, things were once again redefined. The early 1990s, you had the breakup of the USSR, and Russia became a P5 nation, a successor state of the USSR. But Russia was very weak, right? And this was the unipolar moment of the US. So 1990s onwards, you had reshaping of rules. You had sovereignty as responsibility and humanitarian interventions. So what was the concept of humanitarian intervention? When you have a sovereign nation that, according to the international community, is not able to fulfill its governance and other requirements, it's not able to take care of its people, then the international community, by consensus, can intervene for humanitarian purposes in the nation, which means the so-called international community can violate the nation's sovereignty for humanitarian reasons. Okay, and then you had something called sovereignty as responsibility, which again is the same thing, that you are sovereign as long as you are acting responsibly as per the norms laid down by the international community. But if you are violating the norms laid down by the international community, whatever they may be, then we can violate your sovereignty. So let's say you are not democratic enough, or let's say democracy is backsliding in your nation apparently, or if, let's say, there is a religious persecution in your nation. In those circumstances, you are not fulfilling your responsibilities as a responsible member of the world order, of the International Committee of Nations. And that's why, because of that, we can intervene in your nation and interfere in your internal affairs. And these are big sticks that the West uses to beat other nations with. The West means the US. So what is this international community? The international community. Let's find the definition of the international community. Give me a second. I'll try and pull that out of Twitter if it's available. International community. Give me a second. I'm sure there's a good representation of that. International community. Community. Let us see. Do we have international? Okay. What is this international community, right? That's the question we're asking ourselves. Give me a second. Here we are. So the international community that determines whether humanitarian intervention should happen or not. This is the international community. This is the international community. These are the only nations that matter in the international community. So these nations hold the world hostage, and that's the situation. Okay, so that's been the situation since the 1990s. Okay, so you have a situation today where powerful nations can break international law, and you have a situation where powerful nations they are increasingly willing to accept the political costs of violating international law and violating the sovereignty of technically sovereign nations, as long as their interests are safeguarded. And this has created a situation where you have a small number of nations that can act with impunity. These are powerful nations, and the rest of the nations of the world become the arenas where the powerful nations play their geopolitical games. So, for example, is the 1991 Iraq war a violation of sovereignty? I suppose it had UN backing, perhaps. What about 2003, the invasion of Iraq? I suppose that also had United Nations approval. But what about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq by the Americans in 2020? That is clearly a violation of the sovereignty of Iraq. What about the ongoing war against Iran by the US and Israel? That is clearly a violation of Iran's sovereignty. And in response, Iran has violated the sovereignty of the whole bunch of nations in the Gulf region. So when a nation has the might, it is willing to accept the political costs of violating international law and violating the sovereignty of other nations. And it is the weaker nations, like the Gulf nations there, which become the arenas where these geopolitical games are played. That is the situation. Okay, and one of these things, one of the violations, one of the examples of violation of sovereignty is the assassination of the supreme leader of Iran. So now the Americans have created a new normal where they all they have to do is to put this tag on nations that this is a terrorist nation, and put a tag on a person that this leader of whatever nation is a terrorist, and that gives them the justification to kill people. That's the new normal today. So according to, other nations could do the same thing. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Putin could say that Zelensky is a terrorist and take him out. What's preventing Putin from doing the same thing? Exactly as per the American rule book. What's preventing Narendra Modi from tomorrow saying that Asim Munir is a terrorist and taking him out? That's also possible. So if the Americans can do it, others also could, if they can get away with it, do it. So the nations that are willing to bear the political cost of violating international law will do that. It means that only powerful nations can do this. And the weaker nations, they pay the price for the geopolitical games of the powerful nations. So where is India today is the question. So this is not a civilizational might doctrine. This is a military might doctrine. This is an imperial might doctrine. The nations that are capable of hard retaliation, they will do these things. The ones who are not capable of hard retaliation and are not willing to bear the political and other costs of violating international law, they won't do it. Right? So other nations so you're going to have a small number of nations that do these things. The US is a hard retaliator and it's always played this game of regime change and invading other countries. So the US is one. Israel clearly is one that is willing to go to war. Yeah, it's willing to initiate wars. US, Israel, Russia is a hard retaliator. Eventually, when red lines were crossed, it went to war in Ukraine. So Russia is a hard retaliator. So you have Iran is a hard retaliator. They did not initiate the war, but they've hit back very, 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 very hard. So you have the US, Israel, Russia, and Iran that are hard retaliators, and they are willing to bear the political and material and economic costs of warfare and of violating international law. Is China a hard retaliator? I'm not sure about China. Thus far, China has stayed away from these things. China has not gone to war. It tries to bully nations, but it has thus far not gone to war. But time will tell if China also, in the next few months, takes the opportunity to make a move on Taiwan. But China is definitely a very hard retaliator when it comes to economic retaliation. So one could say that there are 5 or so nations: the US, Israel, Russia, Iran, and maybe China, that are capable of playing these games. Where does India stand in this right now? Time will tell us. Okay. Real Vladimir Putin says, what was the ancient Hindu version of Balochistan culture before they converted to Islam? Okay, where is Balochistan? First of all, let's take a look at Balochistan. Where is Balochistan? So Balochistan historically is the border region between India and Persia. Today, Balochistan is split between Iran, eastern Iran, and the western part of the temporary nation Pakistan. Okay, that's Balochistan. So roughly half of Balochistan is in Iran, half of it is temporarily in Pakistan. And historically, Balochistan has been this you could say transition zone between India and Persia. So that is Balochistan. So you have cities like Gwadar and Chabahar that are in Balochistan. You have the port of Gwadar here. This is Gwadar. It's in Balochistan on the Makran coast. You also have Chabahar, which is in Balochistan. Right? I suppose Iran Shahar is also in Balochistan, Sistan and Balochistan province. So that is Balochistan geographically. It's India's western borderlands, Iran's eastern borderlands. That is Balochistan. So what's the history of Balochistan? What did Balochistan look like before it was Islamized, right? So look, if you go back to, like, let's say the first millennium BC, second millennium BC, the people of Balochistan were the descendants of the people of the Saraswati Sindhu region. So, in literature, it's called the Harappan phase of Indian history, or the Indus Valley phase of Indian history. And Balochistan is smack bang in the middle, in the western part of this gigantic region, right? The Saraswati Sindhu, the Sapta Sindhu region. So the people of Balochistan were the descendants of the ancient people of this region, and you could say the descendants of the Harappans, as we all are actually, right? That sort of thing. So you did not have any kingdoms that we know of at the time. Okay, so that is the thing. And then you had in the first millennium BC, you have the Achaemenid dynasty, the great Persian dynasty of Hachemanish, right? The Achaemenid Empire. And Balochistan became kind of part of this empire, because this empire, it expanded eastwards all the way to the west bank of the Sindhu River, the Indus River. So the Indus River became the dividing line between India and Persia at this time, especially during the time of Darius. Darius was this great expansionist king, and obviously he was powerful, so he'll expand eastwards, westwards, and so he expanded his kingdom, his empire, all the way to the west bank of the Indus. So Balochistan came under the Persian Empire at this time. Then you have Alexander coming in, okay, in the 4th century BC, right? He comes and he destroys Persia, and he wants to invade India. So he passes through Balochistan, enters the Sapta Sindhu region, is defeated by Porus, and then limps back to Babylon, where he dies of his injuries or alcoholism or poison or whatever. So Alexander goes back, but he leaves behind governors, and then you have the what is it called? The Seleucid Empire, right? So Balochistan, this region, it comes under Macedonian rule after Persian rule, and then under Seleucid rule. For a few years, it's under Macedonian rule, and then it's under Seleucid rule under as part of the empire of Seleucus Nicator. So Seleucus Nicator and Chandragupta Maurya became allies. They signed a treaty, okay, and much of the Gandhara, etc. region was returned to India but Balochistan remained under the Seleucid Empire. Okay. After the Seleucid Empire, you have various Indo-Greek kingdoms that kind of rule this area. Gandhar, Sindh, this region, and some of these were Buddhist, some of these were Hindu. During the Achaemenid Empire days, in the initial days of the Achaemenid Empire, Balochistan would have been Hindu. Later, it would have come under Zoroastrian rule, but it would probably have remained Hindu. The people would have remained Hindu. So that's the deal. It never essentially was ruled by the Mauryan Empire. Now, after the end of the Indo-Greek era, let's say around 100 BC or something, the first century BC or something, you have Indo-Parthian rule in Balochistan. The Paratharaja Empire, not empire, dynasty. The Paratharaja, which is the Partharaja dynasty, ruled Balochistan. And they were obviously Hindus. You have coins of the Paratharaja dynasty with swastikas all over the place, right? That sort of thing. So the Paratharajas, they ruled Balochistan for a few centuries, and they are clearly a Hindu kingdom, right? And then that kingdom also eventually declines, and then you have Sasanian Iranian rule over Balochistan. So the Sasanians were again Zoroastrians, right? They ruled Iran, eastern Iran, and Balochistan. And after the Sasanians, you have various minor Hindu rulers in Balochistan, and then you have the invasion of the Arabs from Iran, because by this time, by the 7th century or whatever, around this time, the Arabs had taken over Persia, and from Persia they made a move onto India through Balochistan into Sindh, and that is the end of the pre-Islamic history of Balochistan. I've given a very rough overview of that. I'm sure you can have a whole 6-month course about the history of Balochistan, but overall that's the kind of the outline of the history of Balochistan, right? The pre-Islamic history of Balochistan. If you go to Balochistan today, you can see that people are clearly of Indian origin. They are more Indian than Persian. Their language is more similar to Sindhi and Gujarati than to Persian, clearly, right? Their music is very Indian, and they still have some remnants of Hinduism. For example, the Shakti Peeth of Hinglaj Mata is in Balochistan, and people still go there to worship the Devi, right? So there is still a little bit of indigenous culture and religion left in Balochistan, but mostly today, as is the case with most of Pakistan, most of it is now Islamicized. Okay, so that is the deal with Balochistan. Real Vladimir Putin says, what kind of democracy did various Mahajanapadas offer? How was this different from the modern day version of democracy? See, I would say that the modern day version of democracy is the stupidest form of democracy. Once you are a certain age, you can vote. No matter what your IQ is, no matter what your understanding of the world is, you can vote. All you have to do to be able to vote is to be a certain age. Yeah. But so that is the modern 20th century and post 20th century version of democracy. But in older, more mature, or some would say primitive forms of democracy, everyone wasn't allowed to vote. For example, let us examine Greek democracy. The democracy that you had in Athens and other Greek city-states. Well, according to the Europeans, Athens and Greece gave the world democracy. So let's examine the form of democracy we had there. In the Greek city-states, only wealthy land-owning males could vote. Okay? So the wealthy land-owning wealthy land-owning population of the Greek city-states was about 10% roughly of a Greek city-state. The rest of them were either poor people or slaves. Maybe 20-30% of the population was slaves. The rest were poor people, shepherds and farmers and whatnot. And about 10% of the population, male and female, was wealthy people, land-owning people, the nobility, the elites. So out of these 10%, only the males could vote. The adult males could vote. So that's about maybe 5% of the population. These people could vote and these people could stand for election. So it was a very clearly defined small set of people who could come to power and who could vote for those who were standing for power. That was the kind of democracy you had in Athens and the Greek city states. Now, what kind of democracy did we have in the Mahajanapadas, the great Ganarajyas that we had in India? Ganarajya, Ganasangha, that sort of thing. So you had a large, how many? 14 or whatever Mahajanapadas. You had Malla, you had Vajji, you had Shakya, Lichavi, uh, Cambodia, which was in Central Asia, essentially, right? It was northwest of Gandhar. So these were the Mahajanapadas. Some of these were actually monarchies, but some were Ganarajyas, Ganasanghas, which is republics. Okay. So in these republics, what did you have? Uh, you did not have hereditary kings. Uh, the authority, okay, and power, it resided in Ganasabha, Janasabha, or Ganasangha, which is a collective assembly, and that this assembly had the power to make decisions, go to war if needed, and decide what kind of taxes would be imposed, and so on and so forth. All of that, design policies, implement policies, so on and so forth. So you do not have hereditary kings; you had collective assemblies. Now, who could become a member of these assemblies? Was membership open to everybody, or was it restricted? So membership was restricted. Okay. It was restricted to the heads of certain aristocratic Kshatriya families, those who were accustomed to ruling and who knew how to rule. Okay, it was, so the membership was restricted to the heads of these families. And the rest of the people, they would not have any, any share of the power or governance. So these were essentially, you had these elite corporate bodies that wielded the power, and they would elect their own head, who would be a Ganaraja or a Senapati or whatever. They could decide who will be the Senapati, the head of the army, who would be the overall ruler, Ganaraja or Adhyaksha or whatever, that sort of thing. So it was not the democracy in the modern sense of the word, that once you are a certain age, no matter who you are, you can vote. It was not like that. Only the people who were proven to know how to rule, okay, they were allowed to be in power and to vote. Of course, at the lower levels, I suppose you would have anybody could vote for your local municipal body or whatever. But when it comes to the apex of power in the Ganarajya or Ganasangha, it was not open to everybody. But at the local level, to decide, who will be your local municipal head or whatever, I suppose everybody could vote for that. So you had a small inner council or senate-like body of a few, powerful people, and they would rule, and they would prepare the agendas. They would decide the policies. They would administer the day-to-day affairs. They would decide about important matters of state, like warfare, about taxation, about this, that, etc., educational policies, and so on, right? So you had collective decision making, right? You had elected rulers and chiefs. You had equal voting among the assembly members, but not democracies in the modern sense of the word. You could say they were closer in nature to the democracy you had in Greece and Rome. Even in Rome, you had elites who could vote and come to power. Even in Greece, you had elites who could vote and come to power. And even in India, you had the same thing. So these systems were very similar, right? And you can criticize if you want, but it was exactly the same as Greece and Rome. So these were aristocratic democratic republics with deliberative assemblies. These were not these were not like modern democracy where anybody can vote and anybody can stand for power. Once again, even in modern democracy, technically anybody can stand for power, but your papers are scrutinized, the amount of money you put is scrutinized, and lots of people are disqualified. And even if you are allowed to stand for election, you will win election only if you're able to throw a tremendous amount of money into the campaigning process and all of that. So once again, even in India, technically it's free for all, but so de jure it is free for all technically, but in reality only certain people stand even a small chance of winning. So technically democracy seems to be it's open for everybody, but in reality it's not the case. In reality, you can only stand a chance to win an election in India if you can afford to throw maybe 100 200 crores per election from your pocket or from the coffers of whatever political party you may be part of. Only then do you stand a realistic chance of winning. So in the old days, none of that BS was there. None of that hypocrisy that was there. You know what? Everybody can vote and everybody can stand for power. That's what they claim today. But we all know that it's not really how it works. In the old days, it was very clear. It was very transparent. That only certain sections of society, the aristocrats, will be allowed to come to power because they know how to rule. They've been doing it for generations, for centuries. The other people, well, you can vote for your local municipal assemblies and all that, but not for the top positions. That is what it was. Exactly the same as Rome, Greece, and so on. But in Rome and Greece, you had slavery. In India, you never had slavery. So that was one distinction between India as opposed to Rome and Greece. Okay. Real Vladimir Putin says, was there any role of the USSR in the defeat of the Japanese empire? Was there any role of the USSR in the defeat of the Japanese empire? So we're talking about the Second World War. So what are the important dates when it comes to the defeat of the Japanese empire? 6th of August 1945 was the first American nuclear test on Hiroshima. 3 days later, 9th of August 1945, was the second nuclear test on the people of Nagasaki. So 6th August, 9th August. On what date did Japan surrender? Let's find out. I think was it August 15? When did Japan surrender in 1945? It was announced by Emperor Hirohito on 15th of August 1945 and formally signed on the 2nd of September 1945 on a battleship. Right? So 15th of August, it was the Japanese surrender. 6th August, the first nuclear test on Hiroshima. 9th August, the second nuclear test on Nagasaki. 15th of August, surrender. Now, what was the role of the Soviet Union in all of this? So 6th August, Japan is devastated by a nuclear test on Hiroshima, right? And 9th August, this is the second one, but one day before Nagasaki, and 2 days after Hiroshima, which is 8th of August 1945, the USSR declared war on Japan. So the USSR had this pact of neutrality with Japan, pact of non-aggression or whatever it was with Japan, okay? And they walked away from it unilaterally, the Soviets. And on 8th August, 2 days after the Hiroshima atomic test, the USSR declared war on Japan, okay? And it said that it was at war with Japan and it was joining the Potsdam Declaration, which called upon Japan to surrender. So on the 9th of August, early morning, the Soviet army, the Red Army, it launched a massive offensive into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. This is called the brief Soviet-Japanese War, okay? So at that time, Manchuria, which is now part of China, which was never historically part of China. So Manchuria, let's find out where is Manchuria, okay? So that we can orient ourselves. Manchuria. So Manchuria is north of North Korea, okay? Harbin, you could say, is the principal city. No, that's Heilongjiang, but this region overall is Manchuria. And you had, this region was under Japanese occupation at the time, okay? Manchuria. So 9th August, the Soviets invade Manchuria. The Red Army invades Manchuria, launches a major offensive. And they also at the same time attacked the Japanese forces in northern Korea, which is present-day North Korea. the Sakhalin region, the Kuril Islands. Once again, let's see the Sakhalin region and Kuril Islands. Okay. So Sakhalin, okay, is this island here. This island is called Sakhalin. This was, well, historically, you could say at the time, Japanese territory. And the Kuril Islands are these islands here. These islands between the Kamchatka Peninsula over here and Japan. Historically, these were also Japanese islands. Even Sakhalin, at least half of it was Japanese. So the USSR then, on 9th of August, launched an invasion. Okay, it attacked. It launched an offensive into Japanese occupied Manchuria, and it also attacked Japanese forces in northern Korea, in Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. And Japan was already battered; their morale was in bad shape because of the atomic test on Hiroshima. And the Soviets very rapidly defeated the Japanese armed forces. They launched a deep armored offensive into Japanese territory, blitzkrieg style campaign. Okay, and the Japanese resistance collapsed, disintegrated within a few days. So now, what was the set of consequences this produced for Japan? You see, Japan and the USSR had this neutrality pact or non-aggression pact or whatever. Okay, and in August 1945, the Japanese were in bad shape in the war. Okay, and they actually were trying to negotiate with the Soviets, and they wanted the Soviet Union, to be their intermediary in their negotiations with the West, so that there could be some kind of compromised surrender or compromised ceasefire, some kind of negotiated ceasefire with the West. That's what the Japanese were trying to do. They were even willing to offer some territory to the USSR in exchange for the USSR facilitating a negotiated ceasefire with the West on behalf of Japan. So you see, this was their exit strategy. This was Japan's diplomatic exit strategy. They wanted to exit the war, and they were hoping the USSR would help Japan exit the war by negotiating a ceasefire with the West. But the USSR, you could say, backstabbed Japan and entered the war and attacked Japan, destroyed Japan's last standing army, and destroyed Japan's diplomatic exit strategy. So the Soviet entry into the war, it essentially produced strategic bankruptcy for Japan. Japan had no good options left. And then you have Nagasaki. Yeah, 9th of August. So you could say that the USSR's decision to suddenly attack Japan, you could say it had a consequence that was even worse than the atomic bombings on Japan. And maybe it was the USSR's backstabbing that actually pushed the Japanese leadership into accepting blanket surrender terms without any conditions. Right? So this so the USSR played a major role in the way Japan had to surrender. Yeah, if the USSR had not done this, if they had played the role of a mediator between Japan and the West, between Japan and the United States or the Allies, then maybe Japan could have possibly agreed to a ceasefire on certain terms. But yeah, so that's what the USSR did. And that's why Japan, it lost so much territory. It lost the Kuril Islands. The dispute still stands. It lost Sakhalin, and it just accepted all the American terms eventually by August 15. Amisha Mishra says, why was Emperor Hirohito not charged with any war crimes after the Second World War? And why is Hirohito never mentioned when discussing the most dangerous, evil, etc., world leaders? Right. So 15th of August 1945, Japan surrenders to the West, to the Allies, to the Americans, and 2nd September or whatever, they actually formally sign the surrender instrument on an American warship, right? Now, after the Japanese surrender, there is the Tokyo trial, and a large number of Japanese armed forces personnel, top armed forces personnel like Hideki Tojo and so on and so forth, they are put on trial. Hideki Tojo tries to shoot himself in the chest, in the heart. He does pull the trigger. He gets shot, but he somehow survives. And eventually he goes to trial, and eventually he and other Japanese top-ranking military officials and government officials are hanged for their alleged war crimes. So the question is, why was Emperor Hirohito not charged with war crimes? Why was he not part of the accused in the Tokyo trials? Right? That's the question. So there's political reasons for that. The Americans, they had extracted Japan's surrender. They had begun the process of occupying Japan militarily, and they needed the cooperation of the people of Japan. Now, Japanese society of 1945 was very different from, let's say, the Iranian society of 2026. The Japanese system was very different from Iran. In Iran, the Americans today, like 2 weeks ago, assassinated the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. It made no difference to Iran, right? Because the Iranian governmental system and societal system is decentralized. The supreme leader is merely an embodiment of the legitimacy of the IRGC in Iran. But the IRGC is not dependent on the existence of the supreme leader. If the supreme leader is assassinated, the IRGC continues to exist and function, and they can put up a new leader anytime. You assassinate that new leader, they'll put up a third leader. The IRGC is decentralized. It's like a distributed system. It's a distributed fault-tolerant system with multiple nodes. You take out a few nodes, the system still continues to function. So the center of gravity, Karl Clausewitz had this formalism of the center of gravity, which is the most critical aspect of a government. If you take it out, the whole government collapses, right? So for Iran, the whole center of gravity is distributed. You kill the Ayatollah, nothing happens. But in Japan, 1945, the entire political authority legitimacy was embodied in the person of the emperor. The emperor was the son of God. You take out the emperor, and the whole system collapses, and society disintegrates. It is no longer cohesive. And killing the emperor will be treated by the society as an unforgivable crime. And they'll rise up in rebellion. And then the Americans will have to fight Japanese who will be wielding samurai swords. They may not have guns, but they'll fight with samurai swords. They'll fight with knives. So the Americans did not want that sort of chaos in Japan. They wanted an orderly takeover of Japan. So they made the political decision to give Emperor Hirohito, complete blanket immunity from any prosecution. And they made sure that the accused, that is the defendants in the Tokyo trial, they made sure these defendants did not give any testimony that in any shape or form indicted Emperor Hirohito in any manner. So the Americans decided to keep Hirohito as the puppet figurehead of the government, but the real power will now be in the hands of the Americans. But Hirohito will be the titular head of government, the emperor. Banzai. And that's why Hirohito was never charged with any war crimes. To ensure a stable, peaceful, orderly takeover of Japan. And since he was never charged with any war crimes and all that, that's why he was never mentioned when discussing any dangerous world leaders or whatever. And the truth is, Hirohito was not really the guy in charge. Ever since the Meiji Restoration, which was a coup in Japan, ever since this happened, the Japanese emperor was just a figurehead. The real people in power were the people within the government, at lower levels in government, below the emperor. They were the people who were really in power. bureaucrats and officials. And the same was the case during the Second World War. Hirohito was merely the titular emperor. He would sign off on all decisions. All decisions were made in the name of Hirohito, and he had to give his assent or approval. But the decisions were not taken by him. He merely gave his approval. So he was not really, as such, the guy giving the orders. Of course, at the end of the day, the orders were carried out in his name with his signature, I suppose. So you could say that he was responsible at the end of the day for everything. But that's why he was never charged with war crimes, and that's why he is not discussed or mentioned when discussing the most evil and murderous and dangerous world leaders. Okay. Ayush Singh says, can you please tell us the history of the Manipur conflict again? Well, I've done that multiple times, but I'm sure there are new viewers who are not aware of the matter. So I can do that once again. So what I'm going to tell you is exactly what I said in 2023, right? When the entire disaster became visible in Manipur. What is the history of the Manipur conflict? There are so many Manipur experts these days, right? Who have their own versions of what's happening, who the heroes are and who the villains are, and so on. But what's the real history of the Manipur conflict? To understand the real history of the Manipur conflict, you have to understand the history of Manipur itself. What is Manipur? So Manipur is this present-day state in the far east of India. Let's take a look at it, right? Where is this? Let's go to the map and quickly take a look at it and orient ourselves. Which part of India are we referring to? So this is India, as we know. Zoom in, go to the east of India, the far east of India, and here you have Manipur. This is Manipur. The capital city is Imphal. East of Manipur, you have Burma, now called Myanmar, right? So today, Manipur is one of the states of India. Historically, it was a kingdom. Historically, it was much larger at various points in time. There was a time when the king of Manipur captured Mandalay over here, right? There was a time when the king of Manipur even conquered parts of Yunnan in China. And there were times when Manipur was under Burmese occupation and so on. So that is Manipur. Now let's understand Manipur a little bit better. We know there's something called the Manipuri language, right? We know that Manipur, some of you may know that Manipur has a written record of kings going back at least 2,000 years. So you could say 3,500 years. So you have a written record of each king of Manipur over the past 3,500 years, the Ningthauja dynasty. And you have the Manipuri language. And some of you may also know that Manipur is the state that has given India one of its so-called classical dances, the Manipuri classical dance. And Nat Sankirtan and so on, these different manifestations of Manipuri culture. That's what Manipur is famous for. So you have to ask yourself the question. Now today, if you look at Manipur, the demographics of Manipur, there are three main population groups today in Manipur. One is the Meiteis, one is the Nagas, and one is the Kukis. The question today is, and lots of people are confused about this, the question is, who are the original inhabitants of Manipur? That's the question. Is it the Kukis? Is it the Nagas? Is it the Meiteis? Who are the true inhabitants, original indigenous people of Manipur? You have to understand that to understand the conflict. So you have a well-established historical record of the kings of Manipur dating back to at least 2,000 years before today. A large number of kings. The question is, which ethnic group did all these kings belong to? Were they Naga, were they Kuki, or were they Meitei? The answer is that every single king of Manipur was Meitei over the past 2,000 years. Meitei, not Naga. Some of them had Naga blood also, but there's no Kuki. Number two, the Manipuri language. Which ethnic group speaks the Manipuri language? That has been around for at least 2,000 years. Is it the Kukis? Is it the Meiteis? Is it the Nagas? It is the Meiteis who speak the Manipuri language. That has been in existence for at least 2,000 years. Manipuri classical dance. Manipuri Natta Sankirtan. Which ethnic group gave this? Which ethnic group is the progenitor of these cultural manifestations? Is it the Meiteis? Is it the Nagas? Is it the Kukis? It's the Meiteis. So Manipuri language is a Meitei language. Every Manipuri king was a Meitei king. Manipuri dance is a Meitei art form. Manipuri Nat Sankirtan is Meitei. Okay? So Manipur, the history of Manipur is essentially the history of the Meiteis and the Nagas, the people who are called the Nagas. There are various tribes. They are all ethnically and genetically related to the Meiteis, but they live in the hills today. And the Meiteis, they live in the small portion of Manipur, whether it's the Imphal Valley. So the Meiteis and the Nagas, they have blood relations going back at least 2,000 years. And they are the indigenous people of Manipur. Okay? That is established now. And you can fact check that. You can fact check that. Whatever I'm saying. Now the cookies, where did they come from is the question. So if you see, so Manipur has this 2,000-year history of kings. It has its own language. It has its own system of writing, its own script. So Manipur is like a mini civilization in its own right. And historically, its religion was a polytheistic religion. In English, it is called Sanamahism, polytheistic religion. And eventually, it syncretized with what we call Hinduism. And today, a large number of Meiteis practice Vaishnavism. And some practice a combination of Vaishnavism and what is called Sanamahism, and some are practice only Sanamahism. The Nagas were all Christianized by the efforts of Sri Nehruji in the 20th century. Now, if you look at British census records, okay, now before the British census records, Manipur was independent as a kingdom for 2,000 years. Then in early 1800s, Manipur came under Burmese occupation. 7 years of devastation. Okay, and after the Burmese were evicted from Manipur, this happened. At this time, the British became relevant, and they started taking over power in Manipur. To make a long story short, in 1891, the Manipuris went to war against the British to eject them from Manipur, and the British were able to defeat the Manipuris, and that's when Manipur loses its sovereignty. And the British install a fake puppet king. And that's how they destroy the sovereignty of Manipur. And the Meiteis fought a war against the British. So to punish the Meiteis, the British, they enacted a policy to forcibly confine the Meitei people to about 6% of the population of the territory of Manipur. That is the Imphal Valley. The Meiteis were prevented from having any property outside the little Imphal Valley. And to punish the Meiteis further, the British started settling foreign tribals in Manipur from Burma. And these are the cookies. So if you look at the census records of Manipur, British census records from 1900 and so on, in 1900, around that time, you will see less than maybe 1% of the population of Manipur was cookies. And those two were brought in by the British as foreigners who were settled in Manipur to punish the Meiteis. And then over the next few decades, the British brought in more and more cookies in Manipur, and these are all Christianized. Then after 1949, when Manipur officially became a part of India, the government of India, for whatever reason, continued settling cookies into Manipur. Now, if you look at the satellite images of Manipur over the past 10 years, you will see thousands of new villages coming up in Manipur. That is lakhs of cookies crossing over from Burma into Manipuri territory and taking over more than half of Manipur. That is the Manipur conflict. The Manipur conflict is, what is the root cause? It is the foreign occupation of more than half of Manipur by foreigners. Foreign infiltrators. Just like Bangladeshis, just like Rohingyas, the cookies have come in, the borders are open, they've just walked in and taken over territory. And they are terrorizing the locals. And you have American and Ukrainian mercenaries who are coming in, crossing over from Mizoram into Burma, coming with drones, imparting terrorism training to the cookies, giving them drones and whatnot. And the drones, since 2023, have been used to target Manipuri civilians and kill them. So the cookies, they have weapons, all kinds of weapons, unlimited supply of weapons, arms, ammunition, and so on. So this is the Manipur conflict. The Manipur conflict, what is the root cause? The presence of lakhs of foreigners in Manipur. Okay, who are the victims? The indigenous people of Manipur are the victims, the Meiteis and the Nagas. That is the history of the Manipur conflict. And this is a story. This is not a story. This is the history I've been saying since 2023. It has not changed. Okay. And today, The things I have been saying since 2023, they are now coming out. They are now being proven to be true. Slowly, the truth is coming out, isn't it? Right? Just a few days ago, this American terrorist was arrested along with 6 Ukrainian mercenaries. Right? Last year, the chief minister of Mizoram, he said that more than around 2,000 foreigners had come to Mizoram over the past year or so. US and UK nationals who were not really tourists. So this is a geopolitical game to destabilize the region and to create a de facto artificial nation called Cookie Land for Christ, to create more chaos for India and more trouble for India. So that essentially is the Manipur conflict. Okay. Amisha Mishra says, tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan have reportedly escalated after claims that drone strikes were carried out on targets across the border. What triggered the latest escalation? Details of the reported drone strike claims, historical context of Afghanistan-Pakistan tensions, possible regional and geopolitical impact, #geopolitics. Well, this is a historical question as much as a geopolitical question. And just like the Manipur conflict, let's understand the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict. What is the conflict? Why does it exist? So why are Pakistan and Afghanistan hostile to each other? Aren't they both Sunni Islamic nations, Sunni Muslim nations? As Muslim nations, should they be friendly? Brotherly ties should they not have? So why do these two nations hate each other? What is the root cause of the conflict? And it's an intractable conflict. It's not going anywhere. What is the cause of the conflict is the question. The root cause of the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict is a massive border dispute. See, Afghanistan is Gandhar. Gandhar is the first part of India that was Islamized as a consequence of the Turkic introgression into India, the Turkic invasions of India. So the first part of India, Bharatvarsh, that was conquered by the Turks and Islamized was Gandhar, Afghanistan. And then slowly over centuries, they came slowly further into India, and eventually they took over large parts of India. So Afghanistan is the original Kashmir. Okay? And much of Afghanistan was Islamized until the late 20th century. You still had a few lakh, maybe about 1 lakh of Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan. But today there's almost no Hindu, almost maybe a handful of Hindus and Sikhs left in Afghanistan. Most of them have escaped to India. So those Afghan Hindus and Sikhs who escaped to India, they were Pashtuns. Okay, ethnically they were Pashtuns, but by religion they were Hindus and Sikh. And the Pashtuns are anyway an extension of the northern Indian ethnicities. They are an extension of the northern Indian population. Now, Afghanistan, because it was Islamized for 1,000 years, it waged war against the southern parts of India for centuries. The Ghoris started that, and the Ghaznavis continued that, and so on. Then you had the Abdalis and so on. So there was a time when the Afghans, they had conquered and occupied Kashmir. And they were very cruel to the people of Kashmir, and they did all kinds of atrocities and brutalities and so on. And then what happens is in the 19th century, Maharaja Ranjit Singh establishes the Sikh Empire and is a very vigorous conqueror, and he liberates Kashmir from the Afghans. And to punish the Afghans for the atrocities they did on Kashmir, he takes some Afghan territory as well and makes it part of the Sikh Empire. Okay? And he re-establishes Dharma in Kashmir. He again bans cow slaughter and so on and so forth. Okay? So there is Maharaja Ranjit Singh. This is what he did. So to punish the Afghans for their atrocities on the Kashmiris, he took a large part of Pashtun territory as well and made it part of the Sikh Empire. Now, after Maharaja Ranjit Singh's demise, very rapidly his empire collapsed. It was taken over by the British. And whatever territories Maharaja Ranjit Singh had conquered, the British made those territories part of British India, including the Pashtun part of the Sikh Empire that Ranjit Singh had conquered from the Afghans. After 1947, that Pashtun part of British India became part of Pakistan. But if you go there, it is Pashtun dominated. The people there are Pashtuns mostly. Today it's called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And the line that divides Pakistan from Afghanistan is called the Durand line. And the Afghans say that this is an imaginary line that we don't recognize and don't respect. And the Afghans say that Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is Pashtun territory. It should be back. It should be part of Afghanistan. It should not be part of Pakistan. We will never recognize it as part of Pakistan. And that is the major border dispute. As long as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is part of Pakistan, there will never be peace between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And on top of that, you have the Pakistanis who perpetrate barbaric atrocities on the people of Afghanistan. They've launched drone strikes. They've launched airstrikes on Kabul. A recent airstrike hit a hospital that was a rehabilitation center for drug addicts, and about 300-400 patients, unarmed civilians, were killed by the Pakistanis, right? So that's the deal. So the Taliban government will never allow the Pakistanis to get away with this. So the Afghans may not have a fully professional, well-trained, well-equipped army. They may not have nuclear weapons, but they know how to fight guerrilla warfare. And they're going to make life miserable for the Pakistanis, right? So that is the deal. That's the deal. And Afghanistan and India historically, well, have had good relations, right? I mean, one of the tallest leaders of who was a Pashtun was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan spent his whole life fighting for a united India, united independent India. He opposed the formation of Pakistan. And when Pakistan was formed, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan told Mr. Gandhi that you have thrown us to the wolves. And Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan spent much of the rest of his life under house arrest. Okay, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan wanted a united India. So he was Pashtun. He was the Pashtun leader. And when he died, I think he was buried in Afghanistan in, I don't know, Jalalabad or wherever, right? So, yeah. So Afghanistan, India, we have always had good relations in the past century or so. And I wish our Afghan brothers and sisters success against this barbaric, evil, terrorist nation, temporary nation of Pakistan. Hopefully we solve this problem soon. Real Vladimir Putin says, how did Hindu kings deal with differences that existed in Indian society? We had thousands of jatis and hundreds of languages. So imagine you are in a corporation. You are an employee in a corporation. Let's say you are in an IT firm. Let's say you are a programmer. But let's say you have colleagues who are testers, who do QA testing, quality assurance testing. So your jati is programmer, their jati is QA tester. You're totally different people, right? And then you have technical writers. That is a third jati. Then you have the HR people. That's a fourth jati. Then you have the managerial staff. That's a fifth jati. Then you have the canteen people who ensure that everybody is well fed and all. That's a sixth jati. So even in a corporation, you have so many jatis. Are these differences? Do these differences make you hate each other? Not quite, right? You all work together. If any of these jatis is removed from the corporation, the entire functioning of the corporation collapses in a certain way. Some are more important, some are less important, but all are important and all perform a certain role in this cohesive environment that is the corporation. Now, Indian society historically, to extend the analogy, Indian society had thousands, tens of thousands of jatis. These were occupation-based jatis. Some were jewelers, some were goldsmiths, some were ironsmiths, some were textile, some made textiles, some were warriors, some were teachers, some were gurus, some were God knows what, sailors. You had so many different professions and occupations. India was the world's first fully industrialized civilization. Some were architects, some were masons, some were stone workers, some were concrete workers, some made bridges, some made roads. These were all different jatis. These are entire lineages that specialized in one specific profession, super specializations. These were not differences. This was harmony. All these different jatis, they provided very specific services to society, and they were all integral parts of society. These are not differences. This is called organization of society. It's called division of labor. We all need all these things to be done, but we will all specialize in different things, and we will all work cohesively and harmoniously to have this highly evolved and well functioning society. But today, that is portrayed by our historians and our professors and academics as differences. So if you go to a university and you have one professor who's from the physics department, one from the maths department, one from sociology, one from whatever, chemistry, are these differences? Or are they just colleagues who are all providing different services to the students? And eventually, these services are provided to society. Are these differences, or are they actually colleagues who are working together in different roles, but the same function? And they're all serving society. So today we are made to see things in a way that makes us imagine that everything is a further division of society and everybody is hostile to each other. Nobody was hostile to each other. But today, in today's India, politics is such that this caste politics has made everybody hostile to each other. That's the problem. And we see everything from the prism of today's world. But ancient India was not like that. Ancient India was a harmonious society, right? Of course, some people earned more, some people earned less, and so on and so forth. Every society has these issues. These are not issues. These are features of society. Not everybody will earn the same, right? You go to any corporation, does everybody earn the same? No, the manager earns more. A programmer, junior programmer earns less, and so on. That's how it is. So there was no need to deal with imagined differences. There were no differences. Kings, they had one simple role: to ensure that society prospers and society remains safe. And that's what they focused on. They did not have to focus on differences in society. There was no difference in society. Okay, all right. Next. Brown Leprechaun says, how effective are this is from 3 weeks ago. How effective are the THAAD and Patriot missile system? Also, when was the last time the US won a war single-handedly? When was the last time the US won a war single-handedly against anybody? Okay, so let me deal with the THAAD and Patriot system. So THAAD is Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. Okay. The THAAD system has this massively expensive radar. One radar costs more than $1 billion, and they have these very expensive missiles. One missile will be like between $1 to $5 million per piece, and you will need multiple missiles to take out an incoming threat. Typically, a ballistic missile. So that's a THAAD system. And how effective is it? Well, it's only as effective as the radar. And if you destroy the radar, the THAAD system is blind. And the Iranians have been taking out the THAAD radars. The THAAD system is not working anymore. So that's how effective it is. It may be very effective, it may be very accurate, but you kill the radar, the whole system is blind, right? The Patriot system, once again, very expensive system and not very accurate. You need multiple Patriot interceptor missiles to take out an incoming ballistic missile. Obviously, it's like shooting a bullet with a bullet. It's very difficult. And the Iran war has shown that the Patriot and THAAD systems are extremely economically ineffective because each interceptor missile costs millions of dollars, while the incoming ballistics and drones cost a fraction of that. Quantity has a quality of its own. I've been saying for how many years? Well, you're seeing it in action in front of your eyes now. Quantity has a quality of its own. This is a lesson India really desperately, urgently needs to learn. Now, the more pertinent historical question, since we are dealing with history today. When was the last time the United States won a war single-handedly? Good question. So let's think about some of the wars the United States has fought in the reasonably recent past. There's an ongoing war the Americans are fighting. It's against Iran, but they're not fighting alone. Israel is fighting alongside the US, and the various Gulf nations are also kind of providing some services to the US. So the US is not fighting single-handedly. It's not fighting alone against Iran. Iran is fighting an 8 or 9 front war. In India, we worry about a 2.5 front war, right? Iran is fighting an 8 or 9 front war. So this is not a war the US is fighting single-handedly. 2003, the Iraq invasion. This was the US and a coalition of other nations that collectively invaded Iraq and deposed Saddam Hussein. So it was not single-handed victory. 1991, Iraq, once again, a coalition of nations attacked Iraq. So it was not a single-handed victory. Before that, you had Vietnam. The Americans lost Vietnam. So that was a loss. There was a defeat for the US. Before that, you had the Korean War, which was not a victory for the US. They lost half of the Korean Peninsula. So you could say it was kind of semi-defeat for the US. And once again, the US was not fighting alone. So it was a semi-defeat for the US. The Second World War, the Americans, you can say, won, but they were one of the allies. And you had a whole bunch of nations that was fighting against the Nazis and the Soviets and the Italians. And much of the fighting and dying and winning was done by the USSR, not by the US. So the US did not win this war single-handedly. And before that, so which is the last war the Americans won single-handedly? You had the US-Mexico War in the 1800s that they won. But after that, there was one more war I can think of that the Americans won single-handedly. That was the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War of 1898. Okay. So that is a war in which the Americans defeated Spain single-handedly. 1898, you have to go all the way back. So the Americans defeated Spain. They liberated Cuba from Spanish occupation. They also liberated Philippines and Guam from Spanish occupation. But the consequence was that the Americans occupied the Philippines. They essentially bought the Philippines from Spain for about $10 million or something, $20 million. And then the Filipinos went to war against the Americans because they wanted to be free. But the Americans, they effectively replaced Spanish occupation of the Philippines with American occupation of the Philippines. So there was no difference for the Filipinos, right? So anyway, that led to the US-Philippines War, which the Americans eventually won. But that was not a major war. It's hardly a war. So the last war the Americans won was the 1898 Spanish-American War. Since then, they have never won a war single-handedly. Is truth, yes? Is very much truth. Okay. Somi says, shouldn't Rome and the Byzantine Empire be considered to be different? As Rome was pagan and the Byzantine Empire was Christian. Also, why do you say that the capital of the British Empire shifted from London to Washington? Aren't they separate entities too? Good question. That a good question that allows me to explain this in a little more detail. So, Rome, the Roman Empire, and the Byzantine Empire, shouldn't they be considered different? The Roman Empire was pagan. The Byzantine Empire was Christian. So should they not be considered to be different? Well, you see, Christianity became a thing in the Byzantine Empire in the 4th century AD. Before the 4th century AD, around the time, the Byzantine Empire was still pagan. And secondly, the origin of the Byzantine Empire is Rome itself. So it depends on what sort of lens you want to use for your analysis. If you want to look at the situation in 1000 AD, then clearly the Byzantine Empire is a completely separate Christian empire, and there is no Western Roman Empire in existence around 1000 AD. Even 500 AD, the Byzantine Empire is a major Eastern Christian empire, and the Roman Empire is mostly disintegrated in the West. So again, two completely separate entities. But if you go back to 200 AD, then the Byzantine Empire is nothing but an offshoot of the Western Roman Empire. So understand that the origin of the Byzantine Empire is as a child of Rome. And eventually it took its own life, its own separate existence, eventually. So eventually they were different. Today, India and Pakistan are different. But that is relevant if you look at 2026. If you look at 1945, there was no Pakistan. Do you understand this simple difference? So eventually, the Byzantine Empire became a distinct, separate entity from the Roman Empire, and it significantly outlasted the Western Roman Empire. But the Byzantine Empire, there was a time when there was no Byzantine Empire and there was only a Roman Empire. And then the Roman Empire gave birth to a child in Byzantium, which became Constantinople and eventually became a separate entity. Do you understand the difference? And eventually, even when it was born, the Byzantine Empire was originally pagan, just like Rome, polytheistic. And later it became Christian. Please understand the chronology, understand how things evolve. And the same can be said about the British Empire and the American Empire. It's the Anglo-Saxon Empire. Okay? It's the capital of the Anglo-Saxon Empire that moved from London, UK to Washington, DC. Okay, it's the Anglo-Saxon Empire, which encompasses much of the world. Australia, Canada, UK, New Zealand, and the US are part of the Anglo-Saxon Empire. And all their vassal states and occupied states like Japan, Germany, South Korea, etc. These are and EU, NATO nations. These are all part of the Anglo-Saxon Empire. Some are vassal states, some are allied states, some are states under occupation, and some are actually Anglo-Saxon states. Understand that? So that's what happened. Okay? So originally you had a British Empire, and the United States was this relatively weaker entity. But it was the same people, same culture. Eventually, the US became the lifeline for the UK in the Second World War. And that's when the center of gravity moves from London to Washington. Right? Okay. Swami once again says, how important is the Siberia region for Russia? If hypothetically Russia loses it, would Russia just become a boxed-in state in Europe like Poland, Hungary, etc.? That is super easy to invade. Excellent, interesting question. First of all, let's look at Siberia. Let's put the map on the screen. Okay. So Russia is the world's largest nation and widest nation from east to west, west to east, yes. I don't know, 11, 12, or whatever time zones, 15 time zones, whatever it is, whatever the actual number is. And which part of Russia is Siberia? Well, I suppose it's the, from, where does it begin? I suppose Chelyabinsk, Tyumen, Tomsk, Omsk, Krasnoyarsk, Novosibirsk, Irkutsk, Yakutsk, and all the way to, this overall region, Eurasian region. Does Google, let's see, Siberia. Does it give us a separate? Okay, so this shaded region is Siberia. I would not really include Sakhalin and Vladivostok as part of Siberia, but okay, technically it seems to be part of that. Even Kamchatka. So this is Siberia. It's Eastern Russia. It's, you could say, Asiatic Russia. That is Siberia. And then you have European Russia, which is essentially west of the Ural Mountains. And that's the European or Eastern European portion of Russia. But the largest portion is the Eurasian or Asiatic part of Russia, which is Siberia, right? So the question you're asking is, how important is Siberia for Russia? It is super important. It's critically important. It's vitally important. Most of the resources that Russia has are in Siberia, whether it is metal ore, whether it's iron ore, whether it is diamonds, whether it is various chemicals, whether it is oil, whether it's gas. Oil, gas must be Caucasus region, but so much more. The agricultural land, the strategic depth Russia has, the ability for Russia to have an eastern seaboard on the Pacific coast, the proximity to so many nations in Eurasia, all of that is thanks to Russia owning Siberia. It's thanks to Siberia being part of Russia. Whenever Russia has gone to war and it's been under stress, like for example during the Second World War, you had Operation Barbarossa, and the Nazis invaded Russia. They came all the way to the outskirts of Moscow. How did Russia survive that? They moved all their production lines, all their factories into the interiors of Russia, which is into Siberia. They can just keep going east, even if they're invaded, right? And that's why Russia was able to survive. So this gigantic piece of Eurasian territory gives Russia tremendous strategic depth. It gives Russia this inexhaustible reservoir of resources. It's what makes Russia an autarky, right? It's critically important for Russia, the Siberia region, right? If hypothetically Russia loses Siberia, will Russia become a boxed-in state in Europe, just like Poland, Hungary, etc.? Super easy to invade? Not quite. So once again, let's go to the map. Yeah. If you see the non-Siberian part of Russia, yeah, it is still way larger than Poland or Hungary. Way larger. Huge compared to Poland or Hungary. Much larger than Ukraine. It is still the largest entity in the whole of Europe, even if it loses Siberia. So it will not become a boxed-in state like Poland or Hungary. Poland is not quite boxed in. It has a sea coast. Hungary is a landlocked country. If Russia loses Siberia, it will still have access to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and also the Barents Sea, right? So it won't be entirely landlocked at all. But it will lose, obviously, its precious resources in Siberia. And it won't be that easy to invade. It will be relatively easier to invade, but still, it will still be a formidable opponent to have. Okay. Nirvana Shanks says, during the Anglo-Saxon period before 1066 AD, how much cultural and political influence did the Saxon elite retain in the English court, and to what extent did the English bureaucracy retain Anglo-Saxon structures after the Norman conquest of 1066 AD, and were they replaced by Norman systems? Interesting question, but I cannot go into such tremendous details because even I don't remember exactly what specific structures and bureaucratic structures and all we had in England. But let me give you a higher level overview. Okay, so before 1066 AD, England was ruled by the Anglo-Saxons. The Angles and Saxons invaded England sometime in the 5th century, roughly AD. Okay, they invaded from present-day Germany, Saxony, and so on, Anglia. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes came from Germany and England and invaded England. So before the Anglo-Saxon and Jute invasions in the 5th century, England was ruled by Celtic peoples. Of course, England was under Roman occupation for a few centuries. And before the Romans, you had the Celtic peoples and Brittonic peoples who ruled England. So if you look at England's population in the 11th century AD, before 1066 AD, you had a mix of Anglo-Saxons and Celtic peoples who were part of the English population. Okay, and in 1066 AD, you have the Norman invasion of England by William of Normandy, who was then called William the Bastard. But after 1066 AD, he was known as William the Conqueror. Now, in the 11th century AD, the Saxon elite retained all the influence in the English court. All of it, not how much, all of it. So England had cultural elements that came from the Celtic people, right? From the northern lands, Scotland, Ireland, all that. And England had lots of cultural elements that came in from the Scandinavian peoples. For a few centuries, the English paid the Danegeld to the Vikings, yearly tribute of gold to the Vikings. At various periods of time, England was ruled by Scandinavian kings. For example, Canute the Great in the 11th century AD, probably 11th century AD, and then Canute the Great had this great friend who was an earl of his, whose name was Earl Godwin. He was Anglo-Saxon. He was a Saxon lord, and he was a good friend of King Canute, and he had fought with King Canute in Scandinavia in various wars, and they were good friends. So Earl Godwin was the first among the nobility of England. So King Canute was Scandinavian, and Earl Godwin was Anglo-Saxon. So King Canute dies, and he leaves behind 3 or 4 sons. One of them is the King of England, and you have 2 sons in Scandinavia. One is Harold Harefoot, was it? The one is Sweyn, and so on. Messed up thing, yeah. And Earl Godwin has a number of sons. One is Sweyn. He was an absolute crackpot, nutcase. The oldest son, Sweyn. His second son was it Harold? Third was Tostig, and so on. Wolfnot also somewhere. So you had the Anglo-Saxon people who were the elite, the nobility, and they had a very well defined, very well organized system of governance of the British Islands. Okay, and then you have so eventually Harold, the son of Earl Godwin, became the king of England. He was appointed the king. Before him, you had Edward the Confessor, wasn't it? Edward the Confessor, who was a peculiar person. He is regarded as a saint today. He married the daughter of Earl Godwin, but they apparently never had normal marital relations, never had children. And yeah, Edward the Confessor, his mother was Norman, but he hated his mother because she did not ever love him or something, some messed up story, and so on. And eventually, after he dies, you have Harold Godwin's son, the son of Earl Godwin, who becomes the King of England in the year 1066. That's when all hell breaks loose. Harold Hardrada invades England from the north with King Harold's brother Tostig, and King Harold kills them both in a massive, devastating battle of Stamford Bridge. And the moment he wins the Battle of Stamford Bridge, news comes to him that Duke William of Normandy has invaded England from the south. So he has to run with his battered and beaten army all the way down south, and he has to meet the Norman invaders at Hastings. And yeah, Harold got unlucky. He got a arrow in his eye, and that was the beginning of Norman rule. Now, once the Normans started ruling England, they continued much of the same system of governance that the Anglo-Saxons had established. It was a very good system of governance. You had shires, you had hundreds, and so on. And then the Normans, under William of Normandy, they did what? The great survey of England. They compiled the Domesday Book. Okay. And if you study the Domesday Book, you will find that at least 10% of England's population was slaves at the time, and so on. So that's how it happened overall. The details of the bureaucracy and structures and all, you can read them in your own free time. But overall, this is how it happened. Very interesting period of time in the history of England. Abhishek Shukla Live says, please share your views on the belief that Mongols worshipped Lord Shiva. Well, that belief is entirely incorrect. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Mongols worshipped Lord Shiva. Okay? And I'm talking about the time up to the 13th century AD. That until Shri Chinggis Khan was still alive. So the original religion of the Mongol people and the Turkic people also is called, in English language, it's called Tengrism. And a lot of people try to portray this as a monotheistic religion, the worship of the one true God Tengri, which is BS. In the Mongolian religion, there is the worship of the Sky Father Tengri, the Earth Mother Umay, which is like Dyosh Pitru and Prithvi Mata in our old Vedic religion, right? You also have the worship of ancestors, the spirits of your ancestors, the spirits of the forest. You worship trees, you worship hills, you worship mountains. So it's a polytheistic religion, okay? And eventually, after the Mongol conquest of China, Shri Kublai Khan made Buddhism, Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, the de facto state religion of the Mongols. But the Mongols already practiced what is called Tengrism in English. So Tengrism and Vajrayana Buddhism syncretized. And today, if you go to Mongolia, you have Mongolian people who will have in their house a portrait of Sri Chinggis Khan. They will have a portrait of the Buddha, and they will also have Tengrist worship elements in their house. Right? That's how it is. They will have swastikas in the necklaces, in the musical instruments, and knives and whatnot. So it's a very syncretic culture that you have in Mongolia today, religion. And in Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, there is the existence of Maheshwara, Lord Shiva. But typically in Vajrayana Buddhism, Maheshwara or Lord Shiva is depicted as being trampled under the feet of tantric deities. Okay? Is true. Fact check me. Go on. So that's the deal. Okay? The Mongols do have the Trishul in Tengrism, but that's a Tengrist Trishul. It's not the Trishul of Lord Shiva. It's a polytheistic culture, and a lot of things come up, emerge spontaneously that are very similar across neighboring cultures. So the Mongols did not worship Lord Shiva, at least until the time of Sri Chinggis Khan. Later on, because of Indian influences which came in through Tibet, maybe some people may have perhaps worship Lord Shiva, perhaps, but those would be a big, significant minority. Today, you have a syncretic form of Vajrayana Buddhism and Tengrism that is practiced in Mongolia. Just like in Japan, you have a syncretic version of Shinto and Buddhism and Hinduism practiced in Japan. That sort of thing. Okay. I have more questions, but I think I should end it now because it's like over 2 hours. I typically these days do 4.5 hour live streams, but let's end this one at a reasonable time. Taken a whole bunch of questions. So, yeah. Yes. Okay. So I will end the live stream here at a reasonable time today for a change. Today the super chat is off because I wanted to end the stream after 2.5 hours, like I'm doing now. Tomorrow, I'm going to have a live stream in which the super chats will be on, and we can take it 4 hours, 4.5 hours, as long as you want. I will take all of your super chats. Yes, you are right. Whoever it is here, the Garuda is the national bird of Mongolia. Yes, that is true. And the Garuda comes into Mongolia through Tibetan culture. Right? Right. Okay. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to discuss everything, including the Iran war, geopolitics, all that, back to normal programming. But I thought I'll do a history session today just to, calm the temperature, cool the temperature down a little bit. All right. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow in less than 24 hours. Take care. Keep asking questions. Keep learning. Keep raising your standards. And I will see you in tomorrow's live stream. Thank you, everybody. Good day. Good night. Bye-bye.